Good morning again. As I stepped up here, my thumb hit my screen and made my script disappear. So, just a minute. We're all human, right? We can be human with each other. Those of you know, most of you don't know me. Some of you, there are a couple that do. I just want to say that I don't know how time works all the time. Like, it's not always clear. So when I said, sure, I'll preach on Sunday, November 10th to strangers that I've never been with before. And then about a week and a half ago realized, oh, that's the Sunday after Election Day. That could be maybe not great. Please know that my initial intent on being with you, I did not realize that this is where we would be. However, we are, and I actually think that the message I had planned for you still stands. But what I also want to say is that you've probably heard a minister or two in your time as a UU say that we're supposed to preach from scars, not wounds. And what that means is that we're supposed to process our feelings before we share things from the pulpit. That's generally good advice. Sometimes, though, we experience trauma that is acute and chronic, and we don't have the kind of time to process it before we come and share. I find myself in such a situation with you today because since Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, I have been a barely contained ball of rage with side dishes of despair and absolute terror. I'm queer, I'm trans non-binary, I have kids who are brown-skinned. I've been out my entire adult life, which is not a small amount of time. To be clear, things weren't great before Tuesday either for a lot of us, for queers, people of color, immigrants, Palestinian folks. Things were not great then either. We could all tell stories upon stories about how systems have failed us and how policies keep our liberation curtailed. Yet on Tuesday, for a little while, I had some hope before, right? And then that hope just dissipated, just poof. And frankly, I'm not ready to talk about being hopeful or doing organizing or doing what the next right thing. I'm still grieving, and I'm feeling the rage and the despair and the terror. I'll tell you, this week, I did renew my passport. I made appointments for my kids to get theirs, and I looked into the cost of living in Norway, which, by the way, is comparable to Ann Arbor, so I'm not super worried about it. But I don't have a lot of hope right now. And so I'm going to share the message that I brought to share with you today, and it's about conflict in community, because fundamentally I still believe in the power of showing up for one another. And I'm going to also still feel my feelings. Last year I had an incident in a class I was taking where someone lashed out with a great deal of homophobia at me directly in the class. And I had a one-on-one, office hours meeting with the instructor later that day. And because I'm in class mode, right? I said to him, what can I learn? What's the learning here? And he paused for longer than felt good to me in my body, but he paused and he said, it's enough that you feel hurt. You can just feel hurt. And so if you're grieving or feeling sad or afraid, I want you to know that you can just feel that. You don't have to jump up and be ready to organize things or to do things right now. It's okay to take a beat, right? It's okay to just be angry. But please hear me, if you are a person with some kind of privilege, that when a queer person or an immigrant or a person of color asks for asks you for help in the next little while or for the rest of your life, do it. It may mean breaking the law. It may mean lying to authority. It may mean a lot of things that we never thought we'd have to do. And you may be uncomfortable. But I beseech you to please choose someone's safety over your discomfort. Be a co-conspirator. Be a warrior for justice and liberation. Please put your privilege and maybe even your body on the line. I used to believe that when someone in our community made grievous errors or hurt us or someone else, that my obligation then was to kick them out. I believed there were some transgressions we could not ignore. We should do our best to keep everyone safe by kicking folks out of community or barring their future participation. And I said I used to believe that. Two things changed my mind. First, I became a Unitarian Universalist. And second, it happened to me. Not that long ago, I learned that someone I had been in an organizing group with over 20 years ago was holding a grudge against me. I had apparently treated her and a friend of hers unkindly in some interaction regarding the group's finances. I'm here to tell you I have almost no memory of the specific event, though I do remember some tension. I had been living in blissful ignorance for years and years about this person's burning hot coal of resentment toward me that she'd been carrying for decades. And I found out through in common friends, mentioned it in passing, kind of a common knowledge kind of way. Everybody knows this situation. They even let me know that she'd ask people to not invite me to things or not include me in stuff. And I swear to you, I heard a record scratch sound, like that whole feeling. Because I couldn't believe that she'd held on to this thing that I barely remembered, telling who knows how many other mutual acquaintances that I treated her poorly and was not to be trusted, liked, welcomed. I don't know. I suppose I won't ever, right? I found it hard not to be defensive. I still do to some extent. Listen, some life advice that I'll give you, because by the way, I know that unsolicited advice is nearly always criticism, but I also want to say that I generally try to operate from the perspective that other people's opinions of me are none of my business. Full support of that for you as well. But if they bring them to me to discuss, then they're my business, and we can talk about it. This whole thing, though, it felt bigger. It felt like I couldn't say her opinion of me is none of my business. I'm not going to deny that I treated her poorly. I don't remember, like I said. And I'll be honest with you, in my early to mid-20s, I was a hard-edged, obnoxious punk whose frontal lobe had barely finished coalescing. I very well may have said something out of line, or 17 million things out of line. I had no life experience, hardly any work experience. I had not found faith. I hadn't been married and divorced or parented or done any of the other myriad things that give us humility and grace and even tact. My heart had yet to grow into my body. It had yet to fill in the cracks of my own hurt. And I'm certain that there were times back then I said and did things that my current self would be appalled by. Things that hurt others with little to no repair. Truly, I am grateful all the time, nearly every day, as I parent teenagers, that there was no Instagram or Facebook before I was an adult. In any case, I won't deny that I did something unkind. I engaged in the work of that community because I cared about what they were doing. They were working for queer folks, in a small subset of queer folks, And anyone who cared about what they were doing and showed up was immediately put into leadership. Anybody know anything about that process that happens, right? They didn't care much that I had no idea what I was doing because I kept showing up. And showing up was what mattered. And in the midst of that showing up that mattered so much, I hurt this person. I hurt someone with whom I was in community. That was a mistake. I'm sorry for my actions and words that caused hurt. I'm also sorry and sad for whatever I did to make this person think they couldn't just talk to me. That's probably what I'm most sad about in that situation, because had she talked to me, if we'd sat together and discussed the issue, decades of hurt could have been prevented. That burning hot coal would no longer be carried in her hand. Who knows what opportunities we lost, what our community lost, because we did not address the issue head on. Now, all these years later, I may not be any smarter than I was then, but I am sure of a few things. I am sure that no one is disposable. And believe me, I know that that is a hard thing to hear on the Sunday after this past election day, but I mean it. No one is disposable. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone is free to behave in whatever ways they want. Because all people do have inherent worth and dignity, but not all opinions or behavior does. In the beloved community to which we aspire, we don't have the luxury of throwing people out when their actions make us angry or even when they hurt our feelings. If we truly want to be in right relationship, we must face our conflicts. Because I know this unequivocally. We need each other to survive. I'm going to take a small detour. Can we do that? Indulge me in that? Like you have a choice, right? I want to talk about the transcendentalists like Emerson for a minute. And I'm going to start that by saying, to be completely transparent, I did my undergrad in English literature. So when I got to seminary and I had to read Emerson again, I was so mad. I find Emerson's writing to be arrogant and inaccessible on purpose. And that was before I started evaluating his work through a theological lens. Transcendentalism, if you need a refresher, is a spiritual movement of the early 19th century, of which a core belief is the inherent goodness of people and nature. And while society and its institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual, people at their best when truly self-reliant, are at their best when truly self-reliant and independent. End quote. That's writing about what transcendentalism is. Self-reliant and independent sounds a little bit like the opposite of needing one another, doesn't it? Well, much like the Bible, you may be familiar, Emerson's words have been misinterpreted and used for other folks' agendas since he wrote them. Emerson was not foretelling the rugged individualism that American capitalism encourages. Rather, he said we didn't need an intermediary to experience the divine. He encouraged us to rely on our own human intuition to deepen our spirituality instead of specially anointed interpreters of God's word. So we don't need one another, but we can define our faith for ourselves. That is why Emerson is a saintish Unitarian. Transcendentalists had both a 10,000-foot view of the world and a hyper-local view of an individual's experience of that world. The world is dynamic, and divinity is all around. We experience it in our own bodies. The 10,000-foot view shows us that we are moving in concert with each other, just like a murmuration of starlings. Okay, thanks for taking the detour, right? It's the end of construction season around, so we're probably all very used to that. And I wanted to remind us that rugged individualism, right, is not what we talk about when we talk about self-reliance from a faith perspective. Now, the other reason I stopped thinking that we need to kick folks out of community for their errors was when I becoming a Unitarian Universalist, learning my own faith, my own theology, taught me that we are all in this together. We are all reliant on each other, and that we create our own beloved community through our everyday actions. My heart moved into a holy place, as the hymn goes, and I received those blessings. I'm going to take a drink of water. I'd like to draw your attention to this sticker that says "Lit like a chalice." You know, that's how I try to live. I support the closing of prisons and defunding the police. I am an abolitionist. And like one of the OG Universalists, you may have heard of Hosea Ballou, I believe in the power of love and compassion to transform people and communities. And I know that punishment or the threat of punishment is not how we're going to convince or even coerce anyone to do the next right thing. Because when we punish people, we just teach them how to not get caught. We don't teach them how to do the right thing. It's a good short-term solution, I suppose, but it isn't going to create beloved community. Now, earlier today, I was, of course, scanning social media like we're all want to do sometimes when we have a few minutes. And somebody had shared there's a meme of, it's a quote from a writer that I can't remember her name right now, but it's, I don't know how to teach you how to care about other people. And somebody said this to me again earlier this week on Wednesday. They were like, I don't know how to teach the folks who don't how to have empathy. And it's not my job to do it, but you teach empathy, and I'll say, you'll understand why in just a minute, why it's not my job. You teach people empathy by showing them empathy. That's how I teach my kids empathy, is by demonstrating it, by giving it to them, and repeating it over and over and over again. And I'll tell you, as a chaplain, sometimes just going into somebody's hospital room and listening to them is one of the most holy experiences that I ever have. Because listening is a subversive act. Because we get told we're not supposed to listen, we're supposed to wait for our turn to talk, right? And so when we listen to another person, we're demonstrating what love feels like to them. Listening doesn't, I'm jumping ahead to my anti-capitalist part of this, so let me pause there and I'll come back to it. But I just want to say that the way that we work these things into our practice in our daily lives is to not act like cops to each other. I don't police my beloveds. I don't police you because you are my beloveds. I do not get to choose who is welcome. The welcome is unqualified. If we are building the beloved community and we are united in our struggle for collective liberation, and I sure as hell hope we are, we have to deal with our conflict. Conflict is not a reason to give up on getting free, on being liberated. Last year, the Reverend Cecilia Kingman said at General Assembly that liberation is costly because we need to slog through the rough parts of community building. It's not all hearts and flowers. And it is a cliche, but that doesn't make it untrue. The only way out is through. Another way I can practice my abolitionist ideals in my daily life is to seek redemption when I have done wrong. As a Unitarian Universalist, I know that we create our own universal salvation. Heaven and hell is not next time, right? It's right now. It's what we make it. I do not try to make mistakes. I don't try not to make mistakes, right? And while I try to avoid hurting people on purpose, I also know that I cannot prevent it all the time. because I'm a human being. And when I hurt people, I either need to realize that on my own, or someone needs to point it out. I need to then seek redemption. Now, we hear a lot about the word accountability, right? And I don't hate that word necessarily, but I think we're confused by it collectively. Accountability does not mean punishment. It doesn't mean that the person who we perceive to be at fault has to be annihilated in some way. Accountability is just as much about repair as it is about consequences for our actions. My kids learned in preschool, because kids at that age don't do so great with apologies. It's not a thing that they understand or comprehend very much. But what they could understand is that they could do something. So what they were being taught at school was, I'm sorry, how can I help? And that was oftentimes get that kid an ice pack, even if it was for like hurt feelings, right? You still get an ice pack. So we had ice packs falling out of our freezer because it was constantly needed. I have twins, so like it was all the time. And when I've had this conversation where I've said this thing about accountability, in other places I've been challenged, right? What about abusers and predators? What about Trumpers? Do they deserve to be in our beloved community? Well, there's a longer answer, but my initial answer is that while we may need to create structures or boundaries for individual safety, universal means universal. And if we start drawing lines to include some people but not others, who decides where the lines get drawn? Now, if those folks show up in our communities and we hold true to our values, they'll decide to stay or go. But we don't have to kick them out. We can show them a better way. We can show them empathy. We can show them what it means to work towards our freedom, towards our liberation. Obviously, none of this means we invite them or welcome people who want to do us harm. Certainly not how I feel right now at all. Because even if I know that the way to teach empathy is to show empathy, it really isn't my job right now to comfort and care for people who want to legislate me out of existence. It's not my job, and I'm not going to do it. If you'd like to, have at it. In her book, We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice, the prophetic Adrienne Marie Brown, from whom our reading was from, argues that when someone does harm, we focus too narrowly on punishment and exclusion, which doesn't do anything to address root causes of harm. Brown instead asks us to focus on transformative justice through reconciliation, when appropriate, and doing the work of healing. Those things can only happen in community, not isolation, and definitely not if we are kicking people out before we have the chance. Isolation will never create an opportunity for healing or growth because those things happen in tandem with other people. So we also need to ask ourselves, is this harm or is it conflict? Because far too often, right, we overstate conflict as harm. We, as underground writer and public intellectual Clementine Morgan says, conflate interpersonal conflict with interpersonal violence. We do that to bolster our rejection or exclusion from someone in community. We say they harmed us, they were abusive, they were this, they were that. And really, it was just conflict. And here's the thing, human beings disagree with one another. We hurt each other's feelings. We break each other's hearts literally all the time. I have done those things, and I'm sure most of you can think of a time when you have as well. Those things are difficult, and they suck, and it hurts. It sucks to feel that way, but they are not abuse. Conflict makes us nervous and uneasy, and abuse makes us terrified. There's a difference. They are categorically, emphatically different. Sarah Schulman, in her book, Conflict is Not Abuse, echoes what Brown and Morgan and a little bit even what Hosea Ballou said, because she tells us that in many cases we escalate conflict into an accusation of abuse because we are uncomfortable or feel structurally powerless, or we just don't have the skills to resolve the conflict. And she argues this is actually counterproductive. Like Brown, Schulman advocates that we address root causes of conflict rather than punish people. When we feel that unease or nervousness, we need to ask ourselves, what are the root causes here? How do I feel? Do I feel powerless? Am I hurt or otherwise emotionally activated? That's a self-reflective question, right? We need to be asking ourselves those questions. We won't be able to identify the root causes always. That's okay, because, well, we've learned so thoroughly not to see them, right? That's why we can't identify them. We've learned instead to locate our discomfort on someone else instead of the system that is designed the way it's designed. If I think about that original conflict I mentioned what feels like maybe an hour ago to some of you, I know that the root cause was that I felt powerless, right? We were doing emotional work that had immediate impact on our own lives. We were trying to make change in a homophobic, homo-antagonistic system that was regularly and actively harming us, and I guarantee you I felt powerless. And so we were wielding power in the only places we could against each other. One of the best tools that I have ever learned to address conflict is to reorient ourselves from conflict between people, right, to a situation we need to address together. So instead of me versus you, it's us versus the problem. How do we collaborate on solving this issue? That's how we figure it out. That's how we build the beloved community. That's how we have right relationship. Because, and it is evergreen, we need one another. My old comrade and I could have said to one another, I want to figure this out with you. I could have apologized, and perhaps we could have repaired what had been damaged. It's not too late, of course, right? Like, I realize that I just need to look for the opportunity for redemption. But I also invite you to look for your opportunities as well. What conflicts in your life can you address by teaming up with the other people involved? Who can you invite to figure it out with you? Again, I want to say this, I'm talking about in our community already, right? I don't mean, how can you walk up to your neighbor with the 47 Trump signs and say, how do we solve this problem together? Don't do that. I'm saying if the person sitting next to you hurt your feelings in a committee meeting, talk to them. Because the burning coal of resentment in your hand, who is it burning? It's you. It's burning you. These days, it often feels like it's the end times. And late-stage capitalism and the white cis heteropatriarchy have done a damn fine job isolating us from each other, leading us to believe that we are all islands. I want you to hear this. If the only thing you hear me say, we are emphatically not that. We create our own universal salvation by resisting that isolation, by striving for our collective liberation in every breath. Every breath. I need you, beloveds. I need you to survive. Let's sing.